Mrs. Will,
Yes?
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Motion to approve the agenda as presented.
So moved. Second.
Questions, comments, discussion? Call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes?
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes. Can I get a motion to approve the regular board meeting minutes from December 19th, 2024?
So moved?
Second.
Speak closer. It's green on. Hello? Hello?
No. Mine was slow to turn.
I'll talk really loudly if you picked up on someone else's for just a minute. Do we need a roll call for the minutes, or do we do that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, roll call for the minutes.
Mrs. Will,
Yes?
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes. Just as point of information, I am currently acting as the president pro tempore by motion at our December meeting, and later in this, our next action will be nominating a new president. Is there any green sheets for public discussion, Mr. Ackerman?
No, ma'am.
Okay. First motion for today is nomination of the president. So help me with the motions here. Do we have to approve the motion, or we can just do the nomination?
Nomination and then approve the nomination.
Okay,
Approve the nomination.
okay. I would like to nominate Emily Mason for president.
I would like to second that motion.
And Mr. Ackerman, and then we call the roll?
Correct.
Okay, please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes?
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes. And do I continue, or do I hand the? I
Mrs.
keep
Mason.
going. Okay, there we go.
All right, thank you. I would like to have a motion to appoint the Board of Education president. Can I get a motion?
Actually, that should be vice president.
Still, well, are we appointed, we just nominated and then we appoint?
Well, you actually nominated and you approved.
Okay,
Okay.
so now we're on number 5.
Yeah, you're good to go.
Can I have a motion to nominate the vice president?
I nominate Michael Wilson.
I second.
Can I get the roll?
He's catching up.
Oh, yeah, sorry, apologize.
That's okay.
Let's see. Mrs. Will,
Yes?
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes. Congratulations, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you.
All right, next item. Can I get a motion to approve the revised 2025 to 26 academic calendar?
So moved?
Second.
Is there any discussion or questions?
Mr. Speiler, can you highlight, using sign language, can you highlight what might have changed?
Check. All right, so some of the highlights would be same beginning and same end, so nothing changes there. We did have some changes in September. We moved the September 26th day to the 12th, so it's now on the 12th with your approval. The October fall break fell on the 23rd, 24th, 27th, 28th. We moved that back 2 weeks, and that was originally due to the construction calendar, and we missed it. So made more sense to move that back to middle of October, if you will. And then March 5th and 6th, that's a change from, I think, 19th and 20th. And I think that's the changes.
Thank you.
Is there any discussion? With no discussion, please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
I now need a motion to authorize the treasurer to invest inactive and interim funds at the most productive interest rate. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
I think
We
we
skipped
skipped
We
number
skipped
8.
one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right, we'll get you there.
Yep. We're just doing in
Can I get a
reverse.
motion to establish a service fund?
So moved.
Second.
What is the board service fund?
Yes.
That's just where we appropriate money so that you can use it to your desire.
And typically, it's been training.
Trainings, professional development, things like
Right,
that,
yeah.
yeah. Capital conference is an example.
So, this would cover the capital conference.
Correct.
Do we already have established what's gonna be in there for 2025?
You mean how much money?
Do we already have established, I see the 15,000, do we have already established what that 15,000 will go towards?
No,
Okay.
no.
It does enable, like, OSBA has, like, for their fall conference, it's like a small registration fee. I think that's the most that I've seen it.
I'd say majority of the time, you guys use it for fall conference, spring conference, capital conference. There might be some, when you became new board members, board leadership trainings. And
And I'll just say I found that invaluable.
Yeah.
So, but it's a certain amount of money that was set aside just for you, so that you could use it.
Okay, sounds good. Pizza party. Just kidding.
Can you please call the roll?
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
Okay, now I need a motion to authorize the treasurer to invest inactive and interim funds at the most productive interest rate.
So moved.
Second?
Doug, can you just tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. Basically, well, we invest all of our funds, whether they're reserved or not. And this is just means, it lets everyone know that the money is being invested to earn any extra interest possible, whether it be through our operating account or through Red Tree, which is our investment company.
Any discussion on this? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
Now I need a motion to authorize the superintendent to employ temporary personnel as needed.
So moved.
Second?
Is there any discussion on this?
I was wondering what kind of temporary personnel are we referring to?
I think it's is it anybody, until we can get to the next board meeting?
Oh,
Correct.
temporary like that.
Correct, yes.
Yes.
So on a temporary basis, not necessarily a temporary person.
Just so that it doesn't hold up monthly meetings for hiring people.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
Now I need a motion to appoint the superintendent to be the sign-off officer on all student activity accounts, and the superintendent shall present these programs to the Board of Education once a year. The superintendent will also have the authority to approve and/or modify the student activity budgets throughout the year.
So moved.
Second?
And this is just something we do every year with all the student activity accounts.
Correct.
Is there any more discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
Now I need a motion to authorize the following PTA, PTO, and booster groups to be active for fiscal year 2024.
So moved.
Second?
Any discussion?
Doug, are we tracking any of the amounts of monies or where they're, the boosters, are we doing any type of oversight of their funds?
Actually, they're required once a year to provide their expenditures, their revenue and expenditures to us.
Okay.
Yeah.
What time of year do they share those with us?
Usually they do it by the end of the fiscal year.
Okay, so we would have had that towards end of last year. I'm sure I have it, I just didn't see it.
And then, of course, anything that is brought to us, we bring to you for approval as a donation.
Mhm.
But they generally they have their own accounts. They
Correct,
hold their own
correct.
money.
They're all 501c3s, so they take care of their own funds. Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
Now I need a motion to authorize the president, vice president, and treasurer to be the official signers for payments of funds for the Board of Education, and further authorize that one of the three signs checks on all Board of Education accounts, and the president's signature and the treasurer's signature may be a facsimile.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion?
Nope.
Nope.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
Now I need a motion to authorize the treasurer to exercise the then and now certification of funds, provided the funds are within the board-approved appropriations and free of any previous encumbrances.
So moved.
Second?
Mr. Ackerman, can you explain what then and now is?
Sure. The standard procedure is you have budgetary appropriations. Within the budgetary appropriations, you have purchase orders that are created. The purchase orders are supposed to be created before expenditures occur. Occasionally, and usually it happens at the beginning of the year, or quite frequently with a building project, you have invoices come that need to be paid, and they're paid before purchase orders are in place. However, because of the budgetary appropriations that are approved at the beginning of the year, you are not allowed to spend more revenue than you receive, so you're covered. You just bring it to you for approval.
And these items are all budget items. It's really just a
Correct.
PO timing invoice.
Correct.
We've had a lot of those with the new middle school in the
Yes.
past year. Any more questions? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
I need a motion to authorize Jeff Johnson, Director of Business Operations, as the superintendent's designee to serve as the purchasing agent for Milford Exempted Village School District.
So moved.
Second?
Any questions?
Nope.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
I need a motion to appoint Ennis Britting Company, LPA, and Claremont County Prosecutor's Office as legal counsel for the board for 2020, I believe this should read 2025.
Right.
And Dinsmore and Scholl LLP is bond counsel.
So moved.
Second?
So just for clarification, even though we're appointing these, Ennis and Britton and Dinsmore and Scholl as our counsel, we can change these at any time during the year, is that correct?
Correct.
And can you explain why the Claremont County Prosecutor's Office is on there as legal
I think that's
counsel?
just standard. Every district puts their particular county prosecutor on there because they're required by law to help you if you can't afford legal counsel.
Makes sense. Any other questions? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
Now I need, let's see, and I need a motion to approve the treasurer authorization in lieu of the tax budget. So in lieu of the tax budget, which is no longer required by the Claremont County Budget Commission, the board will authorize the treasurer to provide such information to the commission as may be required by the commission to perform its duties and to produce any and all financial records required by the commission to issue a certificate of estimated revenue to start fiscal year 2025.
So moved.
Second.
Do I have any questions? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
Now I need a motion to approve the resolution for advanced payment of taxes.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Ackerman, can you please explain this shortly for us?
Sure. The revenue that is generated through property taxes collected by the auditor and paid by the treasurer is given to us twice a year. You're allowed to ask for it in advance of when those payments come, which is usually around April and August.
And do we collect monthly from them? I
No.
thought we were, last year we had requested that under Mr. Espy.
You can ask for advances as much as you want, but you're at their mercy. So,
Do I have any other questions? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
I need a motion to approve Section 125 plan to be construed, enforced, administered, and the validity determined in accordance with the applicable provisions of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, as amended, if applicable, the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, as amended, and the law of the state of Ohio.
So moved.
Second?
Any questions or discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
I need a motion to approve the following student activities for fiscal year 2025.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion?
Are these just added, or why are these on here?
No, these already exist.
Okay.
We just do this at the beginning of the year, every year.
Yeah, it's just an annual thing.
Okay. Okay, I just saw the competency 4 and 3. I thought that was something unique. I didn't notice the whole table down here. Okay. No, I'm good.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
I need a motion to set the board member compensation at $125 per meeting with a maximum of 12 meetings per year.
So moved.
Second.
And that's unchanged from last year, correct?
And set by the state.
Right, I just wanted to make sure that was clear for everybody.
Right.
Yep.
That this is set by the state, it's unchanged, this is just what it is every year.
Yeah, and it doesn't include special meetings, work sessions, executive sessions, anything outside of the normal 12 meetings that we have every year.
And if you miss one of those 12 meetings, you can't do a makeup meeting with a committee meeting.
Any other discussion or questions? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
I need a motion to approve yearly membership to the Ohio School Board Association.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion?
The Ohio School Board Association has a lot of really good information, training, online. They're a really great resource, so.
Yeah, I was
it's
happy to
definitely-
see them getting a little bit more active towards the end of last year during the lame duck session, so that was, I really appreciated them doing that, so. So they have my vote.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
I need a motion to approve the resolution for travel related to official duties while serving as a school board member.
So moved.
Second?
And this includes like things like travel, going to the Capitol Conference, things like that.
Correct.
Okay. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes?
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
I need a motion to adopt the scheduled Milford Board of Education meeting dates and locations at 6 PM unless otherwise noted.
So moved.
Second?
Any
And
discussion?
they're all Thursdays, except we have the one Tuesday,
We have
right?
one on Tuesday.
And is
yes.
that is November 13th the November that we want? Usually we do right before Veterans Day, or it's after? We talked about this, but I just know November, we usually shift so that we're closer.
Or earlier.
Oh, November 1st is a Saturday, so November 13th would be the 2nd instead of the 3rd. Thursday, that is. Okay.
Please call the roll.
15, 16, 17, I think.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
I need a motion to approve board designations and liaisons as listed for 2025, and we will have some discussion about this.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, this is where we have our different liaisons that we assign to each of the board members, where we are with different community groups. So the superintendent liaison will be the president, so that will be me. The treasurer liaison will be Michael. And then the designation of public records officer, public records training, and tax incentive review council usually goes to our treasurer, so that will be Mr. Ackerman. What we need to decide is the OSBA delegate and legislative liaison, the Chamber of Commerce liaison, the Central Committee, which is all of the PTAs and PTOs, the City Council, Milford City Council liaison, and the Miami Township liaison. And I know we had, last year, Ms. Chestnut was the OSBA delegate and legislative liaison. I know that you have a passion for the legislative liaison. Do you want to keep that?
I would like to, unless anyone else has, yeah? Yep, I'm up for it.
Okay. So we'll continue with Ms. Chestnut in that role. Last year, Chamber of Commerce was Ms. Powers. Is anybody else interested in being the Chamber of Commerce liaison this year?
I'd like to stay with Miami Township,
Okay.
if no one
And I-
objects.
and I can still do that.
Chamber of Commerce.
Chamber of Commerce?
Mhm.
Okay.
I'm fine with that, yeah. I know I'll pick up I think I was on the Milford City Council liaison, but didn't get to be involved as much as I'd like to, but.
Do you want me to do that?
Well, we're gonna meet with the city tomorrow, so I'll keep it. I think I
Okay.
can make more progress on that this year.
Let me know when you can't make a meeting and I'll go.
Okay, so we'll tag team that one. I'll take the lead on it, but
Mhm.
we'll work on that one together.
And I'm happy to stay with the Central Committee, talking to the PTAs and PTOs.
I would be interested, can you let me know when those meetings are? I'd
Yes,
be interested to
absolutely.
join if I can.
Yeah, and this is just a way to stay in touch with the community and know what's going on with these groups. So I have OSBA delegate and legislative liaison as Ms. Chestnut. Chamber of Commerce liaison is Ms. Powers. I will be the Central Committee liaison. I will also be the Superintendent liaison. I have Mr. Wilson as the Treasurer liaison. I have Mr. Wilson as the Milford City Council liaison as well. I have Ms. Will staying as the Miami Township liaison. And then the designation of public records officer, public records training, and tax incentive review council is Mr. Ackerman.
He gets all the most exciting ones, right? Those all sound so interesting.
Those do sound action-packed.
Emily, with your new role, would you rather me do Central Committee? Because I'm on boards Boyd's PTO.
I'm happy
Okay.
to be on it.
Okay.
And I do have passion for the PTAs and PTOs, so I'd be happy to
Sounds
stay
good.
on it. Any more discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes?
Mrs. Powers,
Yes?
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
Okay, next we're going to have the board appointed committees for 2025, which will also have some discussion. I need a motion to approve the board committee members as listed for 2025.
So moved.
Oh, second?
Okay, so.
Can I make one edit to the
Yes.
committees? I don't know if it's on here, but we talked about making it a policy and records committee, so it's just a policy here. So can we update that? Are people okay with that? So it's policy and records. And then I also don't see feet. Oh, it got, feet's on the next page. It just wrapped. And then can we also add audit? Mr. Ackerman had recommended that as a new committee.
What was the last thing you said? I didn't-
Audit.
Okay.
Mr. Ackerman recommended audit.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're gonna run that audit committee on the same schedule as the policy and records committee, is that right?
No, so I have policy and records would be quarterly, which is, so records will just hop on to policy and quarterly, I think that was ad hoc as we needed, but now we'll actually make it a little bit more. And then the audit would be ad hoc as
Okay,
needed
yeah,
by
no,
Mr.
That's how I
Ackerman.
remember you, okay,
Yeah.
yep, that makes sense.
So just for public information, these committees are where we do all the work before we come to the board meeting. And we will have 2 members that are assigned to each committee. In the past, we've gone several of us have gone to all of the meetings for the committees, but we do have 2 delegates for each committee. And we're going to do this a little differently this year. We had talked about with each committee, we will have sort of one board member who's in charge of that committee and will be reporting out to the public what is discussed in that meeting, just for a little more transparency of what goes on in the meetings, because we know that it's very, very hard for the public to come to some of these meetings, especially when they're at 7:30 in the morning.
It's very hard for board members to come at 7:30 in the morning.
Yes, that's true too.
Especially if you have to pass the junior high.
Yes.
So we had a list of who was on the committees for all the past years, and Ms. Chestnut took a stab at reassigning people to committees, just so that we can make sure that everybody gets to work on a different committee, so that we're sort of rotating through and that we learn all of the different aspects of all of the committees. So tentatively, we have Mr. Wilson and Ms. Powers on finance this year, and Mr. Wilson will be in charge of that since he is the vice president.
Yeah, no, that's good.
We have Ms. Chestnut and Mrs. Will on buildings and grounds. We have Mr. Wilson and myself on personnel. And on curriculum and instruction, we have Mrs. Chestnut and myself. For communications, we have Mrs. Will and Ms. Powers. And I think that gets us a good rotation. We also have some quarterly or ad hoc meetings. So we are looking for policy and records. We have Mr. Wilson and Ms. Chestnut. For FEET, which is the extracurriculars in athletics, fine arts, we have Ms. Powers and Mrs. Will. And the audit, which is an ad hoc committee, is Ms. Powers and myself.
Or do we want the audit to be you and Mr. Wilson
Yeah, that makes sense.
as president, as?
Do you want me to stay on
President.
curriculum, Emily? So
That's okay. I'm happy to do curriculum.
I know it's hard for folks in general to see, but there are 5 committees and 5 of us, so 2 members on each. We tried to get to rotate through everybody to see those 2.
So the other thing we have to decide is what time we are meeting. Now, last year and the year before, we met with all of the meetings on one day, and I know that's convenient for a lot of people, and it's inconvenient for a lot of people because of work schedules. So I want to go through the meetings one by one and make sure that they're okay with the board and the members on the committee, of course, and then if it's okay with your team as well.
Can I, before we propose, so finance and personnel are the 2 that tend to go long. So if they're back-to-back, maybe could they be the second in a back-to-back? I don't know. And I also, as the early bird here, on buildings and grounds, and know that my fellow Mr. Johnson is an early bird, would kind of love the 7:30 time slot.
Well, and I'm wondering too, I think it makes sense to move finance to like one of the end ones because it does go over, and that way we won't be like running in. This year we were always running into buildings and grounds, and we want to make sure that we're on schedule just in case we do have members of the community who want to come and visit. We don't want to waste their time by going over in meetings, and just be respectful. So
I would ask we consider having the first meeting at 8 a.m. I guess that you're an early bird, but if we want guests or community people to come, or Mary Ann and me, going by the junior high adds 30, sometimes even more minutes
It
to
does.
the ride. You can't predict it.
Yeah, because of the traffic,
Right.
and especially without busing, I think it's going to be in the future more difficult.
It only takes me half an hour to get from Traverse Creek to here
At that time.
at that time.
Yeah, I'm okay with moving the first meeting to 8 a.m. if that's all right with everyone else.
My concern is on the back, depending on how they all fall out, on the
On the
back end,
back
because
end.
I'm trying to get them done before I start my workday.
So what day do you,
What-
what
so-
time
so
do you
I
need to be
could,
out of here?
But I'm not on finance, so if we kept Thursday morning with buildings and grounds first, then I
And
could
just switch
just
them.
duck out of finance. You know, I mean, like,
Yes.
I don't have to stay for, it's nice if I can stay for all of finance, but if my committee assignment is buildings and grounds, then.
Okay, are we all okay?
But you
with-
also mentioned were you thinking about maybe not all of them being Thursday? Because
Well, I wanted to ask, because I know that
People
that's
like-
convenient for a lot of people and difficult for, it's like half and half. So I wanted to see how we all felt about that.
I'm fine with keeping them all on the same day.
I'm fine with either
Me
one.
too, I like it.
Doesn't matter.
You're the odd one out.
Yeah, so my request would then be, if they are going to be on the same day, maybe if mine could be back-to-back.
In the morning?
Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Do you prefer the morning versus the afternoon?
I do think the morning is a little easier to plan,
Okay.
back-to-back, like, whatever. But then if it works for others to stay, then I could just do buildings and grounds, CNI, and then duck out and continue with, what's the rest of the day? Unless we don't, for superintendent-wise, Friday morning is not great because you do regular meeting. There were issues with other meetings that you had,
We'll
like.
make it work.
So do we want to split a,
We'll make it work.
I'm the only one who likes 2 days, right? So maybe it doesn't matter.
You're the only one that has what?
That
2
likes
days.
2 days, I don't like them all on one day.
I don't like them split. I hate that big split in the middle.
Wednesday,
If we do 4 essentially back-to-back, then that means you might be on a required committee and not, like, you're okay with just staying through committees that aren't necessarily your assigned
Yeah.
committees.
So you're saying.
I've been trying to come to all of them.
You're saying
Yeah, me
ideally,
too.
we would go like from 8
Oh, yeah, give you guys-
Thursday
to-
morning.
or
Gotta give
whatever,
you guys
with
something
all
to
the
do in your
committees.
retirement.
Whatever works for you guys. I'm retired. I can do whatever. And I don't have children at home, so it's easier for me than it is for the rest of you. So I am flexible.
Well, do we have any objection to keeping buildings and grounds on Thursday at 8 a.m.?
Or
Works
we,
for me.
if you
sounds
don't
great.
mind early morning, and we are not coming past, we could do CNI first, because it's you and I. And, sorry, Paul, is that okay? Morning, we'll bring you an extra cup of coffee. And then buildings and grounds. And then I can duck out. The only thing is, I have a recurring 10 o'clock meeting on Thursdays that I can do from here if I need to, but that doesn't give, I don't know that buildings and grounds would go an hour and CNI would go an hour.
Yeah, I feel like CNI would go longer than buildings and grounds. And I feel like we usually do about an hour for CNI, and buildings and grounds is usually a little less than that. So should we plan on 8 AM on Thursdays for CNI and 9 AM for buildings and grounds?
Mhm.
Which leaves us with finance, personnel, and communications.
Yes, I'm fine with just running them right afterwards.
Okay.
Me too.
Fine with what?
Just
Just
going
running them.
straight through. My question for Mr. Parker, do you like communications before, the week before, or is it easier to do like, the reason we had it after is that usually the other 4 committees were like, these are things we're gonna talk about, whereas communication often is like, after the meeting, then we have something we wanna get out.
And we used to have communications
Friday.
after the board meeting.
Yeah, well, that's what, so, right, it's the Monday after now, but it used to be the Friday.
Yes, yes, yes.
The Friday after.
I'm happy to make it work after, but I just want to put on your radar that I think the normal schedule, it would have aligned on MLK Day.
For,
Okay.
for this.
If it was on Monday after, it would have been MLK Day, so that's just schedule.
To be on the Tuesday or whatever. Okay.
I'm happy to have it after, though.
Well, communications.
And that time in the afternoon like it has been?
I think Myra has an issue with that.
What time do you like? If it's,
I meet the school bus on Cook Road at 4. So if we did 3, I just couldn't do 3:30.
well, it is you and Mary Ann, so you could do any time. You don't have you have a retirement schedule.
No, I do not.
mean,
I
you guys could
volunteer
do a
quite
new-
bit.
a new-
What time of the day is good for you?
And you say jump, I say how high.
So what
Come
time works for
on.
you, Myra and Mary Ann? Your ideal, not 3:30, because you have to get back to the bus.
Right.
I'd
I
like
just
1
don't have a
o'clock.
preference. Go ahead.
1 o'clock?
1 o'clock, does
Oh,
that work for you?
Sounds great.
Okay. So
Or
we're
should I say
looking
no,
for
that won't work?
communications on Monday at 1 o'clock. Okay. And then let's do finance at 10 AM on Thursday. And personnel at 11 AM. If that's okay with everyone.
Sounds good.
Okay. And then the rest of them, we just schedule quarterly. So we will do that, but make sure we get the information out before the meetings.
Do we also want to talk about chairs or leads? So we know the only lead we designated was finance.
Yes. So finance will be Mr. Wilson as the vice president. And then for buildings and grounds, we have Mrs. Chestnut and Mrs. Will. Do you have a preference?
Mm-mm. That's fine, I'm happy to do buildings and grounds. I'll chair that one.
Yeah, I think you'd be good for that, Emily, with some, pretty good historical knowledge of the new
Yeah.
building and stuff like that.
For personnel, we have Mr. Wilson and myself. I'm happy to chair that if you want, or if you would like to take over that one as well.
I think you would be a better chair for that one.
Okay, sounds good. And then curriculum and instruction is myself and Mrs. Chestnut. I'm happy to take that one.
Yeah,
Yeah?
yeah, you okay with 2?
Yeah?
Well, that gives you 2, and then Mary Ann or Myra just has 1 between the 2 of them.
Yes.
Do we, if we do buildings and grounds, if Mary Ann does chairmanship of buildings and grounds, and Myra does communication, then we all have 1.
Okay,
Okay,
is that all right?
yeah, it's fine.
All right, so we're going to have Mary Ann as the chair of buildings and grounds. Ms. Powers as communications.
This is all my years of Jenga and logic puzzles put to real life.
Okay, so just to confirm, for finance, I have Mr. Wilson. For buildings and grounds, I have Mrs. Will. For personnel, I have myself. I also have myself on curriculum.
No, me, for curriculum instruction.
Oh,
we
yeah, yeah,
switched.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, Mrs. Chestnut for curriculum and instruction, and then Ms. Powers for communications.
Yes.
All right. And then I'm assuming all of this will be on the website where everyone can see it.
Sure.
What about the chairmanship for
The others-
FEAT?
For the others, yes. So for policy and records, it's Mr. Wilson and Ms. Chestnut.
I feel like Mr. Wilson is especially good with policy.
Yeah, yeah, we could just, since audit's ad hoc, I mean, I'd be happy to chair kind of that,
Okay.
that
Okay.
little group of committees. Because that will kind of, that will kind of flow right out of the finance piece for the audit, so that shouldn't be a heavy lift.
And then for feet, we have Ms. Powers or Mrs. Will.
Which one was that? Sorry.
Feet,
that should
the
be-
Oh, I'm happy to do that.
the extracurriculars.
I think Myra would like that.
Myra's
I
the one
wanna
who
be on
shows
the
up at all.
stage.
She shows up at all those things too, yeah.
Well, if you're the chair of the committee, you might be able to find yourself in on the
Gotta
stage.
dance.
Yeah.
Okay, phew.
All right, well, if that sounds good to everyone, can we please call the roll?
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason.
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes, sorry.
Do we have any other public commentary? No. Okay. Then our next regular board meeting is January 16th, 2025 at 6 p.m. right here at the Milford Schools Administrative Office, 1099 State Route 131, Milford, Ohio 45150. And with that, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Second, yeah.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Will,
Yes.
Mrs. Powers,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mrs. Mason,
Yes.
Mrs. Chestnut.
Yes.
Before we depart, though, thank you, Emily Chestnut, for serving as
over.
Yes.
the president for this past year, okay?
I'm sorry, I forgot to ask for last minute discussion.
That's okay.
It wasn't on the
Organizational
agenda.
meeting is always a little different, but thank you so much for doing that over the last year.
Yes,
Obviously, you're still here on the board, very
Yeah.
impactful, but, as we
Yeah,
know,
of
being the
course.
president does take an additional amount of work and leadership, and you've done a fantastic job at that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
I thought you were going to thank me for my pre-spreadsheet here, because